The $9 trillion question. $9 trillion, that's the official number, a figure so large it loses meaning. For years, this number was the silent engine behind what the world called the Chinese economic miracle. It was the money that built the ghost cities, the high-speed rail to nowhere, the gleaming airports that see no planes. The official narrative sold this as the cost of progress, a necessary investment, but that was a lie. It was a cover story for something else entirely. This wasn't just a development fund. It was the creation of a parallel financial system, a shadow ledger operating outside of Beijing's control, designed to make a select few powerful and to hide a catastrophic risk from the rest of the world. Now, the economic miracle is over. The property market that guaranteed the loans has vanished, and the bills for this $9 trillion ghost engine are finally coming due. The real question isn't how much they spent. It's where did the money really go? And who is about to pay the price for the greatest misallocation of capital in human history? The original sin, Beijing's 1994 decision. To understand the $9 trillion ghost that now haunts the global economy, you cannot start with the empty cities or the crumbling balance sheets of today. You have to go back to a single year, a single decision that fundamentally rewired the economic DNA of modern China. The year was 1994. This isn't just a story about bad debt. It's a story about an intentional act of political engineering that created a paradox so profound, it made the subsequent crisis almost inevitable. It was the system's original sin. Before 1994, China's economic structure was far more decentralized than most Westerners imagine. Following the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, power and, crucially, money had flowed away from the center. Provinces, cities, and local counties retained a very large portion of the taxes they collected. This fostered fierce competition, experimentation, and explosive growth. But it also fostered autonomy. It created powerful regional governors and party secretaries who controlled their own budgets and, to some extent, their own destinies. For the central leadership in Beijing, haunted by the century of humiliation and a long history of fragmentation and powerful regional warlords, this decentralization was not a feature. It was a threat. Power that is not centralized is power that can be challenged. So in 1994, under the leadership of then-Premier Zhu Rongji, a man known for his decisive and often ruthless efficiency, Beijing implemented a sweeping reform. It was called the tax-sharing system. The name sounds innocuous, almost collaborative. The reality was a fiscal coup d'etat executed with bureaucratic precision. Overnight, the rules of the game were changed. The central government rerouted the vast majority of valuable tax revenues, like the value-added tax, directly to its own coffers in Beijing. The local government's share of the total national tax pie was slashed. Sources vary, but the consensus is that the central government's share of revenue jumped from around 22% to over 55%, almost instantly. Local governments went from being financially semi-independent to being supplicants, dependent on transfers and allowances from the very center that had just stripped them of their income. But here is the critical design flaw, the poison pill planted at the heart of the new system. While Beijing took the money, it did not take the responsibility. Local governments were still legally on the hook for almost everything that makes a modern society function. They had to pay for education, healthcare, local infrastructure like roads and sewers, public safety, social welfare, and pensions. The list was endless. This created what economists politely call a fiscal mismatch, a sterile term for a completely impossible situation. Imagine a corporate restructuring where the head office claims 80% of a branch's sales revenue, but still expects that branch to pay 100% of its own rent, salaries, and operating costs. It is designed for failure. Chinese local governments were now responsible for the vast majority of public spending, but were left with a minority of the revenue needed to pay for it. On top of this crippling financial burden, Beijing added an unrelenting political mandate. The entire career path of a local official, from a small-town mayor to a provincial governor, was judged almost exclusively by one, and only one metric: gross domestic product growth. Your value was your number. You had to build. You had to create jobs. You had to pour concrete and expand relentlessly. You had to post a higher GDP figure than your predecessor, and higher than your rival in the next province, year after year, without fail. Failure to deliver growth meant political oblivion. Success meant a promotion, a move to a bigger city, more power, and a seat at the tables of influence. They were being commanded to run a marathon after their legs had been systematically broken. Now, any logical system, when faced with such a gap between income and obligations, would provide a legal, transparent safety valve. In most countries, this takes the form of municipal bonds. A city needs a new bridge. It issues a bond, investors buy it, the bridge gets built. It's a regulated, public process. But the architects of China's new system were obsessed with control, and debt at the local level was seen as a source of instability. So, the 1994 budget law explicitly forbade it. Local governments were legally prohibited from running deficits. They were prohibited from borrowing money directly. They were prohibited from issuing bonds. They were sealed inside a financial prison, starved of revenue, crushed by spending mandates, judged solely on growth, and legally barred from borrowing. From an institutional skeptic's viewpoint, this cannot be seen as an accident or an oversight. It is too perfect in its impossibility. It was a deliberate design. Beijing created an unsolvable paradox, and then, critically, it looked the other way as local officials were forced to engineer a solution. When the official rules make survival impossible, you find a way to operate outside the rules. You create a back door. You build a shadow system. This is the moment of conception for the local government financing vehicle. The LGFV was not a bug that later appeared in the system. It was the feature. It was the necessary, unspoken, and officially deniable consequence of the 1994 decision. It was the ghost in the machine, born not of simple greed, but of systemic desperation, engineered from the very top. It was the only answer to an impossible question. Anatomy of a shadow bank. So the trap was set. Local governments needed to spend money they didn't have and were legally forbidden from borrowing. The solution born from this paradox was the local government financing vehicle, the LGFV. From a distance, it sounds like another piece of boring financial jargon. But when you dissect it, when you follow the money as an auditor would, you realize it's not just a company. It's a key. A key that unlocked a backdoor to the entire state-controlled banking system, creating a shadow financial world that operated in plain sight. Understanding this mechanism is crucial, because it's not just clever accounting. It's the blueprint for the largest accumulation of hidden debt the world has ever seen. Let's break down the anatomy of this ghost engine. An LGFV is, at its core, a shell company. It is a separate legal entity set up and wholly owned by a local government, a city, a province, a district. This separation is the entire point. Because the LGFV is technically a corporation and not the government itself, it is not bound by that pesky 1994 law that forbids government borrowing. It can legally take on debt. This legal fiction, this thin corporate veil, is the foundational trick upon which the entire $9 trillion house of cards is built. Here's how the scheme works in practice. We can call it a three-step waltz. Step 1, the creation of fictitious value. The local government creates the Guizhou Provincial Road and Bridge Corporation, or something similar. This new LGFV has a name, a corporate charter, but no real assets. It has no revenue, no profits, no business history. On paper, it is worthless. No rational bank in the world would lend it a single dollar. So, the local government performs a kind of financial alchemy. It takes a piece of state-owned land, often just an undeveloped, empty plot on the edge of the city, and injects it into the LGFV. This is a purely administrative act, a pen stroke on a ledger. The government then assigns an incredibly optimistic, often completely arbitrary, valuation to that piece of land. A plot that might be worth $5 million is suddenly declared to be worth $50 million on the LGFV's balance sheet. Instantly, the worthless shell company appears to be a valuable, asset-rich corporation. This is the collateral. It's a foundation built not on rock, but on a collective agreement to believe in an inflated number. Step 2. The politically mandated loan. Now that the LGFV has this collateral on its books, its executives, who are often just shuffled over government officials, walk into a bank to ask for a loan. But this isn't a normal commercial transaction. The bank they are visiting is almost always one of China's massive state-owned commercial banks. The local bank manager isn't just a banker, he's also a party member. He understands the political realities. He knows that the LGFV is the mayor's pet project. He knows that the mayor's career, and by extension his own, depends on hitting those GDP growth targets. He knows that denying this loan would be seen as obstructing the party's development goals. It would be a career-ending move. Furthermore, there's an implicit, unwritten guarantee. Everyone in the room knows that while the LGFV is legally separate from the government, it is politically inseparable. If the LGFV were to default, it would be a catastrophic loss of face for the local government. So, the bank lends believing, or being forced to pretend to believe, that the local government will ultimately back the loan, even though there is no explicit legal guarantee. They are not lending against the value of the land. They are lending based on political pressure and the assumption of a state bailout. The bank approves a massive loan, often hundreds of millions of dollars, to the LGFV. The state-owned bank, which is supposed to be a guardian of capital, is effectively forced to lend public savings to a shell company against collateral of dubious value to fund projects that have not been economically vetted. It is a closed loop of political obligation, completely divorced from financial reality. Step 3. The unchecked spending spree. The loan money now flows into the LGFV's bank account, and this is where the system truly bypasses all oversight. This cash is now off budget. It doesn't appear on the local government's official financial statements. It is not subject to the scrutiny of the Central Finance Ministry in Beijing. It is a pool of dark money that the local party secretary can now deploy as he sees fit to meet his GDP targets. The LGFV funnels this borrowed money into massive infrastructure projects: a new subway line, a sprawling convention center, a 6-lane highway. These projects are chosen not for their potential economic return, but for their ability to generate immediate, visible GDP. Pouring concrete is the fastest way to boost your numbers. Whether anyone will actually use the subway or attend a conference at the center is a secondary concern, if it's a concern at all. This 3-step process was replicated tens of thousands of times in virtually every city and province across China. It created a vast, parallel system of public finance that was unregulated, opaque, and unaccountable. It was a shadow banking system operating under the protection of the state itself. The institutional skeptic must ask, was this a flaw, or was it the intended design? The system allowed Beijing to maintain the public narrative of fiscal prudence and centralized control, while privately enabling the very local debt explosion it publicly forbade. It provided plausible deniability. If an LGFV failed, it was a corporate failure, not a government default. This narrative war, this ability to say one thing while doing the opposite, was essential to keeping the machine running for as long as it did. The anatomy of the LGFV is the anatomy of a perfect, systemic hypocrisy. The White Elephant Parade. The money machine was built, a constant, torrential flow of credit summoned out of thin air by the alchemy of LGFVs and state-owned banks. But that money, all $9 trillion of it, had to go somewhere. It couldn't just sit on a ledger. It had to be converted into something physical, something that could be counted, measured, and above all, added to the all-important GDP figures. What followed was not a program of national development. It was a nationwide, 30-year parade of pharaonic construction, a contest in conspicuous waste so vast it reshaped the very landscape of the country. This is the story of the white elephants. The most famous poster child for this phenomenon is a place that became a global curiosity, Ordos in Inner Mongolia. Specifically, its new district, Kangbashi. In the early 2000s, fueled by a local coal boom and access to limitless LGFV credit, the city leaders embarked on a plan of breathtaking ambition. They would build a brand new, futuristic city center from scratch, right in the middle of the desert, a glittering metropolis designed to house over 1 million people. They built it all. Vast, 6-lane boulevards eerily empty, sprawling public squares the size of small towns, silent and windswept, a monumental library shaped like a row of leaning books, a museum that looked like a giant polished stone, and apartment towers, endless rows of identical high-tech apartment towers stretching to the horizon with vacant, glassy eyes. For years, journalists would visit and film haunting footage of this pristine, state-of-the-art ghost city. It was presented as a bizarre outlier, a folly, but the institutional skeptic sees it differently. Ordos wasn't a failure. For the officials who built it, it was a spectacular success. Every ton of steel, every bag of cement, every pane of glass, and every hour of labor was a number that was added directly to the local GDP. The project in its construction phase created a massive, temporary economic boom. The officials in charge were lauded for their vision, for their incredible growth numbers. They were promoted. They moved on. The fact that the city remained a ghost town, that the apartments were empty, that there was no organic economic activity to sustain it, that was a problem for the future, a problem for their successors. The system did not reward sustainability. It rewarded the initial explosion of spending. Ordos wasn't a miscalculation. It was the perfectly logical outcome of a system with perverse incentives. And Ordos was not an anomaly. It was the template. All across China, the White Elephant Parade marched on. In the port city of Tianjin, officials decided to build a new financial district, Ujiapu, that would rival Manhattan. They borrowed over $60 billion and cloned the New York skyline, building replicas of the Rockefeller Center and the Twin Towers. Today, it stands nearly 90% empty, a surreal, post-apocalyptic monument to misplaced ambition, its gleaming skyscrapers reflecting nothing but each other. In Dongguan, developers built the South China Mall, the largest shopping mall in the world by leasable area, twice the size of America's Mall of America. It had space for over 2,300 stores, a giant indoor roller coaster, and a replica of the Arc de Triomphe. It opened in 2005 to a deafening silence. For over a decade, it remained almost entirely vacant, a cavernous, empty cathedral of consumerism with no consumers. The parade wasn't just buildings, it was infrastructure. China's high-speed rail network is a genuine engineering marvel, but a closer look reveals the rot. For every profitable line connecting major hubs like Beijing and Shanghai, there are dozens of others built with LGFV debt that bleed money. Lines built to remote, sparsely populated regions where the gleaming, futuristic stations stand empty, and the multi-billion-dollar trains run with a handful of passengers. Why build them? Because a $50 billion rail project is a massive, one-time injection of GDP that makes a provincial governor look like a genius. Whether the line ever turns a profit is irrelevant to his career trajectory. We see the same pattern in airports. China embarked on an airport-building frenzy, dotting the country with new runways and terminals. Yet nearly three-quarters of them operate at a loss, subsidized by local governments who can't afford it, all in the name of a GDP figure. This is the crucial point to understand. These projects were not investments in the traditional sense. An investment implies an expectation of a future return. These were sacrifices. They were multi-billion-dollar offerings laid at the altar of the GDP statistic. The choice of project was dictated by a simple, cynical logic. What is the fastest way to burn the most capital? A small, profitable factory creates sustainable jobs, but adds only modestly to the GDP. A giant, useless bridge that costs $1 billion adds $1 billion to the GDP figure asterisk this year asterisk. The official who approves the bridge gets his promotion. The debt incurred is socialized, pushed onto the balance sheet of the LGFV, to be dealt with by someone else, years down the line. The narrative war was essential to mask this reality. It was all framed as visionary, long-term thinking. Build it and they will come. The West, for a time, bought this narrative, mesmerized by the scale and speed. But a crisis historian recognizes this rhetoric. It's the same story told during every speculative mania in history, from the Dutch tulip bubble to the dot-com boom. A story that claims the old rules of finance no longer apply, but the rules always apply. You cannot build prosperity on a foundation of unproductive assets. These white elephants are not assets. They are liabilities. They are colossal concrete anchors dragging down the entire economy. Each empty apartment, each silent stadium, and each deserted highway is a physical manifestation of a loan that will never be repaid by the project it funded. The parade is over, and now the bill for the floats, the costumes, and the music has arrived. The extend and pretend doom loop. The white elephants were built. The concrete was poured, the GDP numbers were recorded, and the officials were promoted. But the loans that paid for it all remained. A debt is a promise of future repayment. A rational economic system can only sustain debt if the borrowed money is invested in productive assets that generate enough cash flow to service that debt, to pay the interest and eventually the principal. But the LGFV system was never designed to be rational. It was designed to be fast. And when you have trillions of dollars in loans taken out to build things that generate little to no revenue, you are left with a mathematical certainty. The original loans can never be repaid. This is the point where the crisis should have happened. The point where defaults should have cascaded through the system, forcing a reckoning. But it didn't. Instead, the entire financial apparatus of the state engaged in a decade-long game of make-believe. A game called extend and pretend. This game created a doom loop, a self-perpetuating cycle of borrowing that has the distinct, unmistakable structure of a Ponzi scheme. Let's follow the money through this loop. Imagine an LGFV took out a $1 billion loan 3 years ago to build an empty convention center. The loan is now coming due. The convention center generates no income. The LGFV has no money to repay the principal or even the next interest payment. In a normal market, this is a default. The bank takes a loss, the LGFV goes bankrupt, and the system absorbs the shock. But in China's politically driven system, a default is not a financial event. It is a political failure. It signals that the local government is insolvent, which is an unacceptable loss of face. So, a default is not an option. Instead, the local government simply creates a new LGFV, the Guizhou New Development Corporation. It injects another piece of overvalued land onto its balance sheet. This new LGFV then goes to another state-owned bank, or even the same one, and takes out new larger loan. Let's say $1.5 billion. What happens to this new money? It does not go into building new things. A large portion of it, say $1.1 billion, is immediately used to pay off the principal and the final interest payment of the old $1 billion loan from the first LGFV. The old loan is marked paid in full on the bank's books. No default is recorded. The regulator is happy. The mayor is happy. The bank manager is happy. Everyone's books are clean. But what has actually happened? The total debt in the system has not decreased. It has increased by $500 million, and no new productive asset has been created. They have simply borrowed from the future to paper over the failures of the past. This is the very definition of a Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay off the old investors. And like all such schemes, it is a hungry beast. It requires ever-increasing amounts of new borrowing just to stand still. This cycle, borrowing to pay back old borrowing, became the standard operating procedure for thousands of LGFVs across the country. It created a doom loop with the dynamics of a black hole. The debt began to grow exponentially, not because China was building more, but because it had to service the colossal, unproductive debts of what it had already built. Now, as this cycle accelerated, the state-owned banks, which were the primary source of funding, started to become nervous. There are limits, even political ones, to how many bad loans you can pile onto a bank's official balance sheet without triggering alarms. The system needed a new source of fuel, a way to bring in fresh money from outside the core banking system, and it needed a way to hide the true scale of the risk. This led to the explosion of China's shadow banking sector, particularly through a product that sounds safe and technical: wealth management products, or WMPs. Here's how this next layer of the deception worked. A bank would create a WMP and sell it to its ordinary depositors, regular people, retirees, small business owners. They were marketed as high-yield, super-safe alternatives to a standard savings account. A depositor would be offered, say, 5% interest on a WMP compared to the 1 or 2% they'd get on a normal deposit. It seemed like a great deal. But what the glossy brochures didn't explain was where that high yield was coming from. The money raised from selling these WMPs was not kept on the bank's balance sheet. It was funneled into off-balance sheet vehicles, often opaque trust companies, which then used the money to buy high-risk, high-yield LGFV bonds or make direct loans to struggling LGFVs. This was a work of cynical genius. The risk of the LGFV debt was taken off the bank's books and transferred directly to the household sector, to millions of unsuspecting savers, without their explicit knowledge. It created a vast, hidden architecture of systemic fragility. The entire financial system became interconnected in a web of unstated promises and hidden liabilities. The LGFV owes the trust company, which owes the bank's WMP, which owes the retiree who just wanted a safe place to put his life savings. This extend and pretend game, fueled by shadow banking, allowed the narrative of stability to persist for years. But it's a strategy that has a fatal flaw. It is a race against time and mathematics. Each turn of the cycle, the debt burden gets heavier, and the amount of new money needed to keep the illusion going grows larger. It works only as long as there is infinite confidence and an infinite supply of new credit. But when that confidence falters, or when the source of new money dries up, the loop doesn't just slow down. It collapses inward with catastrophic force. The entire edifice was a chain reaction waiting for a trigger. Who got rich following the money? A system this vast, this opaque, and this flooded with trillions of dollars in untraceable money does not exist by accident, and it does not exist merely to serve abstract goals like GDP growth. A system like this inevitably becomes a feeding trough. To truly understand the LGFV machine, we have to move beyond the macroeconomics and apply the oldest, most cynical lens of analysis there is. Cui bono? Who benefits? When you ignore the official narratives about national development and instead follow the money, as an auditor would, a very different picture emerges. This wasn't just a story of systemic dysfunction. It was the story of one of the greatest transfers of wealth into private hands in modern history, all done under the guise of public service. The first and most obvious beneficiaries were the local government officials themselves, the party secretaries, the mayors, the heads of the planning commissions. The LGFV system handed them a level of discretionary financial power that was unprecedented. They controlled a slush fund that was often larger than their city's official budget, with none of the oversight. This power created a fertile ground for an entire ecosystem of corruption to flourish. The process was brutally simple. An LGFV, controlled by the mayor, receives a billion-dollar loan for a new bridge. The contract to build that bridge is not put out to a transparent, competitive tender. It is awarded to a construction company owned by the mayor's brother-in-law, or perhaps to a company that provides the mayor with a very generous, untraceable consulting fee. The construction company then inflates its costs. A bridge that should cost $700 million is billed at $1 billion. The extra $300 million is then kicked back, siphoned off, and distributed among a network of connected officials and businessmen. Multiply this process by tens of thousands of projects across the country over 2 decades. The numbers become astronomical. Xi Jinping's massive anti-corruption campaign, which has ensnared millions of officials, is often presented as a purely political purge. But it's also a tacit admission of the scale of the rot. The sheer number of officials caught with apartments full of cash, with gold bars, with a portfolio of luxury properties overseas, is a direct testament to the opportunities for graft that the LGFV system created. They didn't just get promoted for hitting their GDP targets. They got personally, fabulously wealthy. The second group of beneficiaries were the construction firms and state-owned enterprises that did the actual building. These were the picks and shovels of the boom. Because the money was essentially free, and the mandate was to spend it as quickly as possible, there was no incentive for efficiency or quality. LGFVs were not demanding customers. They were open spigots of cash. This led to the rise of massive, politically connected construction conglomerates who grew fat on overpriced, non-competitive contracts. They became behemoths, not because they were innovative or efficient, but because they had the right political connections to get a piece of the LGFV pie. Their stock prices soared, their executives became billionaires, and their entire business model was predicated on the continuation of the debt-fueled construction binge. The third, and perhaps most sophisticated group of beneficiaries were the financiers, the bankers, the trust company managers, the creators of the wealth management products. They sat at the intersections of the money flows, taking a cut at every stage. The banks earned fees for arranging the initial loans. The trust companies earned fees for packaging the LGFV debt into investment products. The wealth managers earned commissions for selling those products to the public. Everyone in this chain was getting rich, all while knowing, or at least having a professional obligation to know, that the underlying assets were junk. They were the architects of the system that hid the risk, that diffused the ticking time bomb across millions of ordinary households, and they were paid handsomely for their financial engineering. They created complex, opaque products that allowed them to privatize the profits while socializing the inevitable losses. And this is the heart of the matter. The contrast between who benefited and who was ultimately saddled with the risk is stark. On one side, you have a small, well-connected elite, party officials who built personal fortunes and political careers, construction tycoons who built corporate empires on state-directed capital, and financiers who profited from the churn. Their wealth was immediate, tangible, and often moved offshore into real estate in Vancouver, Sydney, or London. On the other side, you have the entire population of China. The systemic risk was loaded onto them in ways both direct and indirect. It was loaded onto the state-owned banks, whose balance sheets are now filled with trillions in non-performing loans, a liability ultimately backed by the Chinese taxpayer. It was loaded onto the millions of savers who bought those wealth management products, believing their life savings were safe, when in fact they were funding the very last, most desperate stages of the Ponzi scheme. And most fundamentally, it was loaded onto the future of the Chinese economy itself. Every yuan that was siphoned off through corruption or wasted on a white elephant was a yuan that could have been invested in genuine productivity, in healthcare, in education, in technological innovation, in building a real, sustainable consumer economy. The LGFV system didn't just create debt. It actively starved the real economy of capital. It was a massive misallocation of resources, a theft not just of money, but of opportunity. The paper wealth of the few was built directly upon the systemic fragility of the many. The land anchor snaps. Every unsustainable system, every Ponzi scheme, every speculative bubble in history has one thing in common. It needs a constant, ever-increasing flow of new money to survive. For China's LGFV doom loop, that new money didn't just come from bank loans. The entire edifice, the whole game of extend and pretend, was anchored to one single, incredibly lucrative source of real cash. It was the secret fuel that kept the ghost engine running. That fuel was land. For decades, the one thing a local government could count on was the skyrocketing value of urban real estate. This wasn't just a parallel income stream. It was the foundation of the entire shadow financial system. And in 2021, that foundation didn't just crack, it vaporized. To understand the severity of this shock, you have to go back to the fiscal trap created in 1994. With their tax revenues stripped, local governments were desperate for any source of income they could control directly. The Chinese constitution states that all urban land is owned by the state. This gave local governments a monopoly on a golden goose. They could take rural land from farmers at a very low, fixed price, rezone it for urban development, and then auction off the long-term usage rights to property developers for astronomical sums. These land sales became their primary source of legitimate, on-budget revenue. At the peak, this income accounted for over 40% of local government revenues nationwide. It was the cash they used to pay for basic services, and more importantly, it was the cash that provided a veneer of solvency, making the banks more willing to lend to their LGFVs. This created a deeply symbiotic and deeply toxic relationship between local governments and property developers. The government needed ever higher land prices to fund itself. The developers needed cheap credit and a constant supply of new land to build on. They were partners in a shared speculative mania. This partnership fueled the biggest property boom in human history. The value of Chinese real estate grew to be worth more than the entire property markets of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. It was an asset bubble of unprecedented scale, built on the belief that prices would only ever go up. And for a generation, they did. This is the critical link. The LGFV system and the property bubble were not two separate stories. They were two sides of the same coin. The LGFV borrowed money to build the infrastructure, the roads, the subways, the utilities, that made the land valuable in the first place. The government then sold that now valuable land to a developer like Evergrande. Evergrande, in turn, borrowed colossal sums to buy the land and build apartment towers. And the local government used the cash from the land sale to pay the interest on its existing LGFV debts, giving it the capacity to borrow even more. It was a closed loop, a perpetual motion machine powered by the ever-increasing price of land. The land was the anchor holding the entire fragile system in place. Then came the crisis that everyone saw coming but no one could stop. Beijing, finally waking up to the systemic risk, tried to deleverage the property sector. They implemented the Three Red Lines policy, a set of strict borrowing limits designed to curb the developers' reckless expansion. The policy was a pinprick aimed at a balloon. It worked, but far too well. The developers who were most reliant on constant new debt to survive, the giants like Evergrande and Country Garden, were suddenly cut off. Their credit lines snapped. They could no longer finish pre-sold apartments. They could no longer pay their suppliers, and crucially, they could no longer afford to buy new land from local governments. The collapse was breathtaking in its speed and finality. Evergrande's default in 2021 was the starting pistol. What followed was a complete freezing of the market. Land auctions, which were once scenes of frantic bidding wars, suddenly saw no bidders at all. Land sales, the primary cash cow for local governments, plummeted. In 2022, revenues from land sales fell by nearly 25%. In some provinces, the fall was over 50%. The golden goose was dead. This is not a separate crisis that is happening alongside the LGFV problem. This is the trigger event. This is the moment the fuel line to the LGFV engine was decisively cut. The extend and pretend doom loop depended on a constant flow of new money, and a huge part of that money, directly or indirectly, came from the property bubble. With land sales gone, the local governments lost their only significant source of real cash. They no longer had the money to service the interest on their existing LGFV debts. The banks, seeing the primary source of repayment disappear, became terrified to issue new loans. The entire mechanism of rolling over old debt with new debt seized up. The doom loop is now mathematically broken. It is no longer a loop, it's a downward spiral. The LGFVs are now coming to the banks for new loans, not with the implicit backing of a booming land market, but with the stench of insolvency. The game is over. The snapping of the land anchor has transformed the LGFV issue from a chronic, manageable disease into an acute, terminal crisis. The question is no longer if the defaults will happen, but how the state will manage the ensuing implosion. Beijing's impossible choice. The game is over. The perpetual motion machine has run out of fuel, and the $9 trillion bill has finally been presented for payment. For decades, the central government in Beijing maintained a calculated and cynical distance from the LGFV problem. It was a local issue, a corporate matter. This narrative of plausible deniability allowed them to benefit from the GDP growth the system produced, without ever officially acknowledging the colossal risks it created. But now, with the property market gone and thousands of LGFVs on the brink of domino-like defaults, the problem has arrived on their doorstep. The deniability is gone. The crisis is national, and it has forced the central leadership into a classic trilemma, a strategic nightmare where they are faced with three choices, each with devastating consequences. There is no good option. There is no clean escape. There is only the cold, game theory calculation of choosing the least catastrophic path forward. Option A is the path of overwhelming force, a massive, centralized bailout. In this scenario, the central government would effectively nationalize the entire LGFV debt. The People's Bank of China would print trillions of yuan, or issue colossal amounts of central government bonds, and use the money to pay off the LGFV's liabilities, recapitalize the state-owned banks, and make the holders of wealth management products whole. On the surface, this looks like the classic shock and awe response that China is known for. It prevents an immediate, disorderly collapse. It stops the financial panic. It maintains the illusion of control. But the second and third-order consequences are terrifying. Firstly, a bailout of this magnitude would be wildly inflationary. Injecting that much new money into the economy without a corresponding increase in productivity would devalue the currency and could lead to the kind of runaway inflation that destroys the savings of ordinary citizens, the very people the bailout is supposed to protect. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it creates a catastrophic moral hazard. A full bailout sends a clear message to every local official and bank manager in the country. There are no consequences for reckless behavior. It rewards the corrupt and the incompetent. It validates the entire system of shadow finance and guarantees that as soon as the immediate crisis is over, the exact same behavior will start all over again, only bigger next time. It's a solution that solves the present crisis by planting the seeds of a much larger one in the future. Option B is the polar opposite, the path of brutal market discipline. Beijing could simply stand aside and let the dominoes fall. Let the LGFVs default. Let the banks that lent to them suffer the losses. Let the investors in WMPs be wiped out. This approach appeals to the hardliners. It would purge the system of its excesses. It would impose accountability and teach a harsh lesson about risk. It would, in theory, cleanse the financial system and allow for a healthier, more sustainable model to emerge from the ashes. But the cost of this cleansing fire would be an inferno. A wave of uncontrolled LGFV defaults would not be a contained event. It would be a Lehman Brothers moment on a scale the world has never seen. It would instantly render a huge portion of the Chinese banking system insolvent. A banking crisis would trigger a credit crunch, starving even healthy businesses of the capital they need to operate. This would lead to mass layoffs, a collapse in consumer spending, and a deep, brutal recession. The social consequences would be unthinkable. Millions of households who invested their life savings in WMPs would be financially ruined overnight. This is the path to widespread social unrest, a scenario that the Communist Party fears above all else. For a government whose entire legitimacy is built on delivering stability and prosperity, deliberately triggering a Great Depression-style collapse is not just a bad economic choice. It is political suicide. This leaves option C, the middle path. The path that most crisis historians would predict they will take, because it's the one that politicians always gravitate towards: delay and obfuscation. This is the path of debt restructuring, of kicking the can down the road. In this scenario, Beijing would orchestrate a series of forced, behind-the-scenes deals. LGFV loans would be restructured, with maturities extended out for 30 or 40 years and interest rates slashed to near zero. Banks would be pressured to accept these zombie loans and pretend they are still performing, avoiding the need to declare a formal default. Some of the debt might be swapped for new, long-term central government bonds. This approach avoids the hyperinflation of a full bailout and the immediate collapse of the let-it-burn strategy. But it is a slow poison. It condemns the economy to a long, grinding period of stagnation, famously known as a lost decade, or in China's case, perhaps 2 or 3. By keeping zombie companies alive and forcing banks to carry trillions in unproductive debt on their books, you paralyze the entire financial system. Banks become unwilling and unable to lend to new, innovative companies. Capital is trapped in the unproductive past, unable to finance the productive future. The economy stagnates. Youth unemployment, already at crisis levels, becomes a permanent feature. The Chinese dream of ever-increasing prosperity dies. This is the path Japan took in the 1990s after its own property bubble burst, and the country has arguably never fully recovered its economic dynamism. It is the path of quiet, managed decline. A bailout, a collapse, or a generation of stagnation. This is the impossible choice Beijing now faces. Each path leads to a different kind of disaster. Their decision will not be based on what is best for the economy in the long run, but on what they believe is most likely to ensure the survival of the party in the short run. And as they weigh these terrible options, the clock is ticking. The global contagion. It is tempting, particularly in the West, to view this crisis with a sense of distance, to see it as a purely domestic Chinese problem, a self-inflicted wound from a rival power. This is a dangerously naive perspective. In the hyperconnected global economy of the 21st century, there is no such thing as a contained crisis of this magnitude. The narrative that this can be walled off, that the financial contagion can be stopped at China's borders, is a comforting fiction. The reality is that the shockwaves from the LGFV implosion are already propagating outwards through multiple, complex channels. This is not just China's problem. It is a global problem, and the world is woefully unprepared for the fallout. The first and most direct channel of contagion is the formal financial system. For years, lured by the promise of higher yields and the narrative of China's unstoppable growth, international investors piled into Chinese assets. Global investment funds, pension funds, and insurance companies bought billions of dollars worth of bonds issued by Chinese property developers, and in some cases, the LGFVs themselves. While many of these were dollar-denominated bonds issued offshore, the ability of the issuer to pay depends entirely on the health of their domestic operations. As these entities default, international bondholders are discovering a harsh reality. Their legal claims are tenuous at best, and their chances of recovering their capital are close to zero. These are direct, immediate losses that will show up on the balance sheets of financial institutions in New York, London, and Tokyo. Beyond bondholders, major international banks have significant loan exposure to the Chinese corporate sector. While the exact numbers are opaque, institutions like HSBC and Standard Chartered, as well as major American and European investment banks, have been deeply involved in financing the very companies now at the heart of the crisis. A wave of corporate defaults in China will lead to significant write-downs and losses for these global banks, tightening their lending standards not just in Asia, but globally. This creates the risk of a worldwide credit crunch, triggered by events half a world away. The second, and perhaps more powerful, channel of contagion is through the real economy, through the physical flow of goods and raw materials. For the last 2 decades, China has been the single largest engine of global growth. More than that, it has been the world's construction site. The insatiable demand created by the LGFV-fueled infrastructure and property boom has single-handedly driven the price of almost every major industrial commodity. China consumes over half of the world's steel, copper, and cement. It is the dominant buyer of iron ore from Australia and Brazil, of copper from Chile and Peru, of oil from the Middle East. When that construction suddenly stops, which is what a deep recession or a lost decade scenario implies, that demand vanishes. The impact on commodity exporting countries will be devastating. Nations like Australia, whose entire economic model has been built on feeding China's construction boom, will face a brutal recession. The same is true for many developing nations in Africa and Latin America. A collapse in commodity prices will crater their export revenues, trigger sovereign debt crises, and create profound political instability. This is the butterfly effect of the LGFV crisis. An empty apartment building in Tianjin leads to a currency collapse in Zambia. Furthermore, the impact on manufacturing powerhouses that feed into the Chinese supply chain will be severe. Countries like Germany, with its high-end machinery and factory equipment, and South Korea, with its advanced electronics, have become deeply dependent on the Chinese market. A prolonged Chinese recession means a collapse in orders for German cars, French luxury goods, and Korean microchips. This will drag these export-oriented economies down, risking recession in Europe and parts of Asia that are core to the global system. Finally, there is the deflationary shockwave. For years, the world has benefited from China as a source of cheap manufactured goods, which has helped keep a lid on inflation. But a China mired in a deep, debt-driven recession is a different beast. It becomes a source of global deflation. A country with massive industrial overcapacity and collapsing domestic demand will have no choice but to try and export its way out of trouble. This means dumping vast quantities of cheap goods, from steel to solar panels to electric vehicles, onto the global market at prices no one can compete with. This could decimate manufacturing industries in other countries, leading to job losses and protectionist backlash, potentially triggering a vicious cycle of trade wars that would further cripple the global economy. The crisis that began with a flawed tax law in 1994 is not ending in a quiet, orderly restructuring behind the Great Firewall. It is metastasizing, whether through direct financial losses, a collapse in commodity markets, or a global deflationary shock. The consequences of China's debt reckoning will be felt in every corner of the world. The era of China as the unstoppable engine of global growth is over. The world must now prepare for the era of China as a primary source of global instability.